first night of Hanukkah. It's Monday night in 2 weeks, I think so. I will check immediately. No, Tuesday night is the first night of Hanukkah, but the Shir Beis Hashem will take place not next week, but in 2 weeks, Monday night. The Siyata D'Shmai. Sunday night, yes. I seem to be a bit confused today. So in 2 weeks, Beis Hashem, the next year. Vayishlach Yankov Malacham Aleisov. And Yankov's message is, Im Lovan Garti. Rashi says, Im Lovan Garti, V'Taryag Mitzvahs Shomar. And what seems obvious from Rashi, when the Gemara says, Kiyom Avrom Avinu Kol HaTorah Kula Ad Shelo Nitna, it is not only Avrom Avinu, but obviously Avrom, Yitzchak, Yankov, the Shlotim, and so on. If Rashi says, Im Lovan Garti, the Taryag, the Mitzvah, Shomar, it seems to be quite obvious. It is not only Sheva Mitzvahs B'nai Noach that Yankov was diligent about, but Taryag Mitzvahs Shomar. We find a tremendous Chiddush Rambam in 3 different sources in the Rambam, and the Chiddush is so unique and so novel that many Achronim have difficulty accepting this Chiddush. But the Rambam in 3 different sources maintains that a non-Jew could be Mekayim Taryag Mitzvahs and he will receive Schar Min HaShomayim. Not Sheva Mitzvahs B'nai Noach only, not even Mitzvahs Shebein Odom L'Chaveroi. There's a very famous Chiddush from the Netziv. The Netziv, in his Haskama to Ahavas Chesed of the Chofetz Chaim, writes a Chiddush that non-Jews are mechuyev in all the Mitzvahs Shebein Odom L'Chaveroi. But the Rambam is mechadish. A non-Jew could perform Yiddish mitzvahs, Taryag mitzvahs. He'll wear tzitzis, he'll be mafish tumas amaises, and he will be mekabel sachar. Where do we find this Chiddush Rambam? 3 different sources. Perek Gimel, Mishnah Tes, Mesechet Trumas, and Parsha Mishnah of the Rambam. The Rambam explains the Shitta of Reb Shimon, Nochli Shetoram Trumosoi Truma. That a non-Jew that is not for Tumas Amaisis, the Tumas Amaisis are valid. And the Rambam explains, if a non-Jew cannot partake in our mitzvahs, then the Tumah will have no validity. It would be totally void. The fact that a non-Jew could be Mafish Tumas Amaisis and Kedushas Atruma Ischal with his Afrosha is because Choykim Imonu B'Sachar, and a non-Jew is not mechuyev in Tumas Amaisis, but if he wishes to be Mekayim Tumas Amaisis, then he has a mitzvah, and he receives reward, and therefore his Afrosha is valid. Kach Kosav Rambam, Perek Gimel Mishnah Tes, Mesechet Trumas, Parsha Mishnah, and that Mishnah is brought at the beginning of the second Perek of Mesechet Kiddushin, according to Reb Shimon, Nochri Shetoram Trumosoi Truma. The Rambam writes in Perek Yud in Hilchas Malachim, Halacha Tes. Hilchas Malachim is where the Rambam writes all the halachas of Sheva Mitzvahs B'nai Noach. And after the Rambam goes through the many details in Sheva Mitzvahs B'nai Noach, Chosav Rambam Halacha Yud. Ben Noach Sherotzo Lansis Mitzvah Mishar Mitzvahs HaTorah. Kedei Lekabel Sechar. We will not prevent him from performing a mitzvah ki hilchosa. Im hevi yoyim mekabel mimenu, nosen tzedakah mekabel mimenu, v'yira'eli, shenoisen zman Yisrael. So the basic rule, but the Rambam writes, Ben Noach she'rotze la'asos mitzvah mishar, mitzvah satorah kedei lekabel sechar, Ein moine moisoi lasois oiso ki halachosa. There are the bars. On the spot, there are bars is mechadish a chidush midrate de nafshei. And the Rambam writes, Umekol mochoim, b'mitzvah shetzrichim kedusha v'tahara. Igon tefillin, sefer Torah v'mezuzah, ani choichech lahachmio, shelo yonichu oisom la'asoiso. So the Radbaz writes, ani choichech lahachmio. And the formulation of this Radbaz, the use of the Radbaz proves that he writes it in Svara. I assume, I think, writes the Radbaz, that those mitzvahs that involve the chetz of the kedusha, tefillin, sefer Torah, mezuzah, we do not enable them to partake of those mitzvahs. And this proves that in the interpretation of the Radbaz, the Rambam doesn't essentially mean tzedakah and korbanos only, but the entire spectrum of mitzvahs. Ukepashtus l'shoin Rambam. Ben noyach sharot zarasis mitzvah mishar mitzvahs haTorah. The entire spectrum of mitzvahs. The examples that Rambam gives is korbanos and tzedakah. But that is only because we find in Shas, what is the din? Hakum, noidrim, v'noidrim, nedorim, v'nedoris ki yisor. We find a sugim b'vavasa that Nochrim give tzedakah. And that is the signon of the Rambam. He usually brings only the halachos that we find in the Talmud, in the Gemara. But the formulation of the Reisha, Ben noyach shalot zarasis mitzvah mishar mitzvah satorah kadeh lekabel sachar, ein moine moisa lasis oiso ki halachosa, proves that a non-Jew could perform various mitzvahs and he will receive sachar. And that it says, tefillin, mezuzah, sefer Torah. Now that is a chetz in the kedusha, and only Yisrael am kedoshim should have a kesher with the chetz in the kedusha. So when I visit various different yeshivas, primarily Torah's Chaim in Moscow and other places throughout the world, yeshivas that deal with kiruv, and there are places in the world where you do kiruv, essentially part of the Talmidim ain't Jewish. When we first came to Russia, we tried to bring the Jewish multitudes back home to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. There was almost no families in which both parents were Jewish. Either the father was Jewish and the mother not, or the mother was Jewish. So when I visited the yeshiva, many of the boys, were in yeshiva learning and davening in the process of Gelus. In a humorous way, when I came back from Torah's Chaim the first time, I told a friend, I know that you're looking for a shidduch for your daughter, and I have a wonderful suggestion, a wonderful boy. He's a big Loudon, and he's a tremendous Yer Shamayim. I saw him davening, I was inspired, and I was moved, and he's also very intelligent. He has a university degree. The only problem might be he's not Jewish. All the rest, I think, he's really fitting for your daughter. He's a great boy. So, they asked me various shaylas. So I said the boy should not put on tefillin. And my feeling was that he shouldn't even wear tzitzis, because tzitzis comes to remind us of Taryag Mitzvahs. He's not about chiyuva. But they learn Torah and they daven. So the Rambam writes, a goy could partake of Taryag Mitzvah should be sought, and he will receive sachar. Source number 3 is in Hilchas Mila, and that is a surprise. That is somewhat of a surprise. The Rambam writes in Hilchas Mila, Perek Gimel, Halacha Zayin. And why is Mila a surprise? Because Mila is Brisa Shel Avraham Avinu. And there's a very well-known medrash that Avraham Avinu sits in Shari Gehenim, and he checks the people that are herded into Gehenim, and those that are Chosam B'Ois B'Skodesh, he doesn't let them into Gehenim. So how would he differentiate between a Yid and a Goy if we are entitled to circumcise, to give mitzvahs Mila to a non-Jew? Well, obviously Avraham Avinu knows how to differentiate between Ois B'Skodesh, Shel B'nai Yisrael, and a Gentile that merely wants to receive Sechar Mitzvah. However, Kusav Rambam, Perek Halacha Zayin, Hilchas Mila, Goy shetzorach lachtoich or losoi mipnei makoi shin, shenoilad bo, osel yisor lachtoich lo yoisa, shegoyim lo mal nisa mit devisa lo marina nisa leo. V'yavol mishenasas mitzvah berafu azu sharei lo nischaven a mitzvah. Lefichoch im nischaven hagoy lemila, mutar li Yisrael lo mul oisoi. Im nischaven hagoy lemila, mutar li Yisrael lo mul oisoi. So if his kavana is lemila, mutar li Yisrael lo mul oisoi. So I know that some Achronim, encountering this Rambam, and it was so remote to them to accept or understand that according to the Rambam, a goy could perform mitzvahs and he would be makabel sahar. They want to be mefanish the Rambam that his kavon is to geiris, but that is an interpretation which is totally not only unreasonable but unacceptable. What's the chiddush mutar lo say? V'kilo yadam shegeiris. Geiris is a tremendous mitzvah. Is the Rambam mechadish in Hilchas Mila mutar lamur goy if he wants to be magaya? That's in Hilchas Asur Bia. There's an entire study of geiris. That doesn't belong in Mila. The Rambam writes, if it's a medical procedure, then we should abstain. This is a study in which we won't be dealing today. But Chazal, in their time, said that we should not engage in healing non-Jews. However, if his intention is to be Makayim Mitzvahs Mila, then we will perform Mila. So the Rambam once again goes to Shittosai. A guy is entitled to perform Taryag Mitzvahs, and he will receive schar. In a way, Kodesh Baruch Hu likes the idea. Otherwise, he wouldn't give schar. In a way, a non-Jew, if he wants to have somewhat of a shaykhus to Klal Yisrael, cherishing their mitzvahs, with no intention of gerus, they will receive schar. So the Rambam Perkut of Hilchos Malachim writes it as a general rule. The chiddush in Hilchos Mila is ois bris kodesh beini uveincho uvein zaracho achrecho. A goy could partake. In this week's parasha, we learned the sugya of Dino and Achei Yankov, Shimon Valevi. And the Ramban and all the commentators after them all deal, the Rambam Hilchos Malachim and the Ramban al Torah. Why did Shimon Valevi kill Anshe Shechem? Mechet Uma Pishon. Why did they deserve to be killed, to be destroyed? And there are many different interpretations. The Rambam writes that they were over on Dinim. The Ramban writes they were all Shoifchei Domim and Megalei Arayas. The Chidush Harim says, just like Chazal say, Nochri she'osek b'Torah chayav misa, Nochri she'mal chayav misa. Because Mila is a oisis ben HaKodesh Baruch Hu ben b'nei Yisrael. That's what the Chidush Harim said. And obviously it goes against the Rambam. The Rambam writes that Nochri not only is entitled to do mitzvahs Mila, and he isn't chayav misa, and he will also receive sachar, according to what the Rambam explains in Perek Gimel and Mesechet Chutz. So this Rambam seems to be a tremendous chiddush.
Terwijl ik neem als taas, tell them to go and do Mila in order for it to be chayav misa.
Yes, so the sugya we are dealing with today is not the sugya of Shimon Valevi, the Anshe Shechem. In Minchas Rosh Hashanah, there is a discussion about this sugya. I just brought the Chidush Harim not because I want to get into the sugya of Shimon Valevi and Anshe Shechem, just because the interpretation, the Mahalach of the Chidush Harim is mistal, is contradicted by the Rambam that we just learned. So this Rambam is a tremendous issue. There's a very relevance, halacha l'maisa. Well, on the fringes, it might, but there's a very well-known discussion. What is the din of a kodesh and zgan of a toichanei asfira? Does he continue Sfis Hohen with the bracha or without a bracha? And this is a discussion many are going to deal with. The siyata d'shmai, when we will reach the emes here, maybe we will discuss it at greater length. But this is a major discussion on Chodesh. So, Minigal Oilam is that Kodesh has got the Torah sphere continues counting spheres going with the bracha. What would be the denigration is Gaia Torah sphere, and he was in Yeshivas Toras Chaim from day one on, and he counted sphere even though he was not yet Jewish. He didn't even skip one day. So would we say it's the same as a Kot? A Kot is not about Chiyuv and a Goy is not about Chiyuv? No, I don't think so. I think light years apart. It is true, a goy is entitled if he wishes to do so, but a goyish mitzvah and a yiddish mitzvah are essentially two different aspects in mahus. They have nothing in common. The goy will receive schar, but when he is Nisgaya, besides the idea, the concept, the halach of Gershon Gaiva Kutten Shenoila Dona, essentially the mitzvahs are not of the same nature. It has nothing to do. A Kotten is not Rabbi Yuba, but he's Jewish as a Gadol is. And therefore, the days that he counted as a Kotten do count, Lacha should be a mitzvahs, but a Goy counts has no kesher. But the mitzvahs he is to perform after he is mechnas lebris, and therefore, I think even in accordance to the Shittim Rambam, it has no relevance in the din of Kodesh Gaiva. We would not say the same regarding Gershon Gaiva, the Torah Yemei Asvi. The Igros Moshe, Rav Moshe Yoredei Chelik Beis Siman Zion, was asked about his opinion on the Rambam. And he is so adamant, Skemish Zion can be. How could a goy have a shaykhus with Yiddish mitzvahs? And therefore he deals with each of the three sources in Rambam. And he writes, that is the shit of the Rambam. So Rav Moshe has two arguments. One argument, it has no source in Shas. And this is a halacha which the Rambam cannot be mechadish medated and avshei. This is not something, even the greatest of Gedolim could be mechadish mesvara. This needs to have a source in Shas. So what I wish to do in today's shir is to bring 7 possible sources from Bavli, from Yerushalmi, from Droshim, from which the Rambam obviously could have learned this tremendous chiddush. But Rav Moshe has another argument. The Lamed Aleph in Kedushin and some other sources in Shas, we find Rav Yosef says, Mireish Hava Yamina. Rav Yosef had a Hava Yamina. He once maintained, Godol Misha Ena Mitzvah Boisa and Misha Mitzvah Boisa. A person that performs mitzvahs on a voluntary basis is greater, and he has a higher level, and he will receive more schar than a Mitzvah Boisa, because the person that's Mitzvah Boisa, he's just doing what is required. But Ena Mitzvah Boisa, that is an order that became on a voluntary basis, is in a far greater spiritual height. And then Rav Yosef changed his opinion, and he says, God love mitzvah vayishlach Misha, Eino mitzvah vayishlach. I'm going to show him there are 2 explanations why mitzvah vayishlach would be greater than mitzvah vayishlach. So Rav Moshe has an argument like this. According to the Rambam, when a goy performs a mitzvah, he's godel than a Jew that performs the same mitzvah, because he is a mitzvah vayishlach, according to the Yosef's Havamina. How could Rav Yosef have a Havamina that a non-Jew performs a mitzvah, and it makes more nachasua for HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and it's more precious than what he is Makayim HaMitzvah? That's impossible. And therefore, one cannot say that a goy could be Makayim Yiddish mitzvahs. That's Moshe's argument.
A goy is not an Eina Mitzvah.
What?
A goy is not an Eina Mitzvah. Shashayach is still Mitzvah and Eina Mitzvah. That's a goy. You keep the goy inside.
Well, he definitely is Einoi Mitzvah.
Not in the Bechina. Not in the Bechina for Eina Mitzvah. He's Einoi Bechlau.
Rav Altman, I can guess what you're trying to say. Let me say it, and I assume you will agree. Probably it's the same thing. Mitzvah v'oisa v'eino mitzvah v'oisa is only one of a great array of yesodis that determine how precious a mitzvah is. It is not the only yardstick. It is only one of many. A yid that's mitzvah v'oisa is greater than a mitzvah v'oisa. According to the Yosef's Havamina, a Jew that's a mitzvah v'oisa greater than a mitzvah v'oisa. In the same token, we would say nochri she'ena mitzvah v'oisa is greater than a mitzvah v'oisa. But there are additional factors. Chavivim Yisrael shenikru bonim l'moket. Every human being is precious to a certain degree. The Taisis Yamtiv and other Mefarshim and Mishnayos say, Chovav Odom Shenivra B'Tzelem is every human being. They were all created B'Tzelem Elokim. Odom Orishim Nivru B'Tzelem Elokim. So when Rabbi Kiva says in the second of his Chovav Odom Shenivra B'Tzelem, that includes every human being. But then Rabbi Kiva goes on to say, Chavidim Yisrael Shenikru Borim Lamokim, Chiv Yisrael and Das Dem Shenikru Borim Lamokim. So the difference between a Jew performing mitzvahs and a non-Jew performing mitzvahs is 1,000 or 1,000,000 light years. Jews amongst themselves, non-Jews amongst themselves. That is a different question. The voluntary one or the mandatory one, which one is greater? And that was the Havana and the Miskon of the case. But that is only one factor. That is only one question, one yardstick. So when a Jew performs a mitzvah, it is far more precious to a Kodesh Baruch Hu than a non-Jew performing that same mitzvah, regardless of whether he's mitzvah vayishlach or Einar mitzvah vayishlach, and therefore I don't think that is an argument that carries much weight. It definitely isn't sufficient to reject Pashtus Divrei Rambam. And when we learn the Rambam in its Pashtus, it is very clear that that is the Shitta of the Rambam. But once again, we're dealing with the big Kiddush, of which many of the great Achronim were not aware. Moshe Rav Chaim HaKodesh in Pashtus Yisrael writes the Pashtus. He writes that a goy could have no chaylik besides Sheva Mitzvahs B'nei Noach. We do not find that a goy could partake in our mitzvahs. He has no shaykhis, and that is what the Rav Chaim writes with Pashtus. And the Chazon Ish writes the same in Yored Deya Simin Samechei Osavah. What is the sugya the Chazon Ish is dealing with? By the Zohar Samech Dalet. Who is a Ger Toshev? How do we define a Ger Toshev, and which non-Jews have the din of a Ger Toshev? A Ger Toshev has very distinct halachas. Halacha number 1, he is entitled to live in Eretz Yisrael. The non-Jews that are not willing to take upon themselves the halachas of Ger Toshev are not entitled to be amongst us in Eretz Yisrael. Ger Toshev could live in our land. The other halacha is Ger Toshev atam mitzvah l'achyoisai. We need to care for them. We need to provide for their needs. We need to take care of them as we do with our brethren. So who is defined a Ger Toshev? 3 different shittas in the Gemara and the Zohar Samech Dalet. According to one shitta, every non-Jew shekil al atzmai lo lavoid avoid zorah. Minimal requirement. He is not an idol worshipper. He is not an avoid avoid zorah. He could be a Ger Toshev. Opinion number 2, Sheva Mitzvahs B'nei Noach. It is not enough not to be an avoid avoid zorah. He needs to take upon himself Sheva Mitzvahs Noach. Opinion number 3, Kibel atzmai kol HaTorah kol HaV'yoy from Avelis. Taryag Mitzvahs. So the Chazon Ish, Yored Deya Simin Samechai wonders, why would there be any significance in a guy taking upon himself Taryag Mitzvahs? What kesher does he have with Taryag Mitzvahs? Mida Mishosha Izbu, asks the Chazon Ish. What does that mean? It means nothing. What kesher does a guy have with Taryag Mitzvahs? That he would be defined as a Ger Toshev only if he takes upon himself Taryag Mitzvahs. So the Chazon Ish writes a pshat, an idea, which I think is extremely unreasonable. He writes, he's just going through the acts, like a clown. But we require him to do the Taryag Mitzvah, that our children shouldn't learn from him to violate those same mitzvahs. And therefore we expect and demand from a Ger Toshev, you gotta be Mekayim Taryag Mitzvahs, come to shul, put on tefillin, put on tzitzis. Why? The Chazon Ish writes, means nothing. But we don't want our children to see people that don't put on tefillin and don't put on tzitzis and aren't Mekayim the mitzvahs, and therefore we require a Ger Toshev to be Mekayim Taryag Mitzvahs. That is what the Chazon Ish writes. And I think it's a Perish Rochik Ad Lama'oi, which is just based on the fact that the Chazon Ish found difficulty in giving any significance to a mitzvah that a non-Jew would be Mekayim. And to me it's a Pella. Chazon Ish Mora de Kula Talmuda. No one is greater than a Chazon Ish. I say many times, Chazon Ish in my eyes is like a Rishon. But he did not seem to be aware of these 3 Rambams, and the Rambam writes Beferish that a guy could take upon himself to be Mekayim other mitzvahs, Yiddish mitzvahs, and he Zachar. So the Pasha said, Gemara Misyashav B'Fidi B'Chazim. So the Moshe writes, where did the Rambam pick this up? I mean, how could the Rambam in Echad Shalocha that has no source anywhere in the Gemara? So I would like to just touch briefly 7 different sugyas that we find in Bali, in Yerushalmi, and on Medrocham, and each of these 7 sugyas could be a basis of the Rambam to be Mechadish this Gevaldi Yiddish. The Regoy could be Mekayim Yiddish mitzvahs, and they have some mitzvahs. First of all, we started off this year. Yaakov says in Lovan Garti, Rashi is Mefarish, the source of the Medish, Vetaria, the mitzvahs Shamargi. And Yaakov wasn't the first. He wasn't the only one. Yaakov obviously saw Yitzchak and the Zayda Avram, Kim Avram being called and there's a major discussion among the Rishonim. The Ovis Bifnei Matan Torah. What was their din? Did they have a din Yisor or a din Ben Noach? And the Mishnah Rebbe wrote an entire Sefer. Sefer Proshas V'Lacham of the Mishnah Melech. The Mishnah Melech was one of the greatest Rabbanim of all the Achronim. Nobody, no Ram, isn't familiar with the Mishnah Melech. But one of the Soul Mishnah Melech wrote this Proshas V'Lacham on Torah, and most of the Sefer is busy with the question, what was the din of us? Did they have a din Yisor or a din Ben Noach? Obviously, if they had a din Ben Noach, and this is a matter discussed not only by the Mishnah Melech and Proshas V'Lacham, the Ramban. The Ramban deals with this question, and the Ram, Chidush Aran and Sanhedrin, Daf Nun Ches, and Rashi, Chidush Daf Yud Ches. There are many sources in the Rishonim. So my question is, if the Ovis had a din of Ben Noach, and nevertheless they were Makayim Tayyab Mitzvahs, would this prove that a Ben Noach could take upon himself the Kiyum of Tayyab Mitzvahs and it means something? One could reject this araya, and I think he would be right. Because I think a few weeks ago, in one of the first shiurim we gave on Chumash Bereshis, I mentioned that Rav Chaim Brisker made a very simple argument. And it's so kosher that if it wouldn't be Rav Chaim, I would say it, everyone would say it. But it bears far more weight if Rav Chaim says, so Rav Chaim argued. Ad kan lo yinechlak u'rashonim, only in the din of the Ovis, whether they had a din Yisor or din Ben Noach. But essentially, only a total fool would think that the Ovis were goy. The Tata Avrom is given Ayi, and Yitzchak, and Yaakov. Rav Waldman says a Yaman Stein. I don't know. Maybe a Kneich. I won't wonder if it would be a Tarush. I don't know. I don't know whether it was a Chassid or a Litva, or maybe a Sephardi. I have no idea. But he was Jewish. Klal Yisrael and Kedushas Yisrael starts off with Avrom Avinu V'Bris Bein HaVesorim. Ein Koden Ovesel L'Shloisha, so Chaim said. The others were in the Bnei Noach. The question that Rishonim and Achronim deal with is it possible that there should be a Din Yisrael of Nation in the Torah Yisrael? The name Matan Torah, how could there be a Din Yisrael? Din Yisrael was not yet given. Before HaKadosh Baruch Hu appeared on Har Sinai and he gave Torah's Moshe to Klal Yisrael, how could there be a Din Yisrael? But Kedushas Yisrael. And the essence of Klal Yisrael definitely started with Avram Avinu. And that's what we cannot learn from Avram Avinu to Bnei Noach L'Dorasayim. However, there's a tremendous solution places Bava Mitzvah Daf Ayin. And Bava Mitzvah Daf Ayin steht in Gemara that a guy that abstains from ribis is Makabel Sachar. And Tosfos asks, why? Ribis is not one of the Sheva Mitzvahs Bnei Noach. And Tosfos offers 2 different explanations. Number 1. Gezel de Bnei Noach includes the entire system of moments. Different than Bnei Yisrael, not Dinim. Gezel. The Yisrael of Gezel from Bnei Noach includes the entire spectrum of Choshen Mishpah. In Torah Yisrael, there are different mitzvahs. Geneva, Gezela, Beinoah, Ribis. Each one of these is a separate law. But Tosfos argues, by Bnei Noach, the Sheva mitzvahs of Bnei Noach are fundamentals, general principles, and they include many of different mitzvahs. So Tosfos says, Gezel de Bnei Noach will include ribis. That's pshat, says Tosfos, goyim are not mitzvah in ribbis, but nevertheless, if he's Makayim ribbis, he gets zachar. Kemoy Avram Avinu shekim kol Torah kula ad shelo nitno. So Tosfos is the one, and Bava Metzia defined, that argues we could learn from Avram Avinu shekim kol Torah kula ad shelo nitno that hu adin liyacham matan Torah, a guy that takes upon himself to abstain from ribbis, is Makabel Sachar. So obviously, that could be Shittas HaRambam. In the same logic as we find in Tosfos Bava Metzia Dafayin. And from Avraham Avinu and Yaakov Avinu, Shekim Kol Torah Kol Ad Shelo Nitno, we learn that the same rule applies to Bnei Noach Le'acham Matan Torah. If they are Mekayim Kol Torah Kulo, they are Makabel Sachar. Because the one that draws this comparison is Tosfos and Bava Metzia Dafayin. So this definitely could be source number one. Source number two is the Gemara we find in Avodas or Gimel Adalaf, Bava Kama Amad Chesed Adalaf, and a very well-known phrase from Chazal. Afilu akim sha'oisig b'Torah, haleu kikoyin godol. So the Gemara asks in both sources, Nochi she'osig b'Torah chayav misa. The Gemara answers, B'sheva mitzvahs didei. A goy can't earn our mitzvahs. He learns Masechet Bava Metzia or Bava Kama? No. Now, Rishon also in the Torah Chayav Misa, but in his Sheva Mitzvahs, and maybe that includes Ribbis, Hilchos Ribbis in Yeridea, according to one teretz in Tosfos of Bava Metzia, Harei K'koyin Gadol. Well, if it would be Hechshor Mitzvah Belvad, how would it be K'koyin Gadol? So obviously, when a guy learns Torah, those parts of Torah that he is entitled to learn, obliged to learn, it is the essence of mitzvahs and Torah. And therefore, it elevates him to a medrega that Chazal say, Hareu k'koyin gadol. A guy is mitzvah in Talmud Torah. He has Sheva mitzvahs. He needs to learn the halachas of those Sheva mitzvahs, but that is only Hechshor mitzvah. The reason he needs to learn the halachas of those Sheva mitzvahs is just he needs to know how to perform his mitzvahs, his obligations. But if Chazal say Hareu k'koyin gadol, Yekorahim mepninim, that means essentially it has a mile of Talmud Torah. And therefore it is maybe from here that the Rambam learned. A guy that is Makayim mitzvahs that he is not mitzvah, taking Talmud Torah as an example, it has the cheshivas. However, in reality, I always had difficulty understanding this Mama Chazal. Well, there is one shevet in Klal Yisrael that is above all the others. The Manas HaKadoshim, that is Shevet HaKohen. V'kidash, and the Kohen Gadol is the holiest of the holiest. One shevet of Klal Yisrael, and none Jew that learns Torah is Kohen Gadol. Seems to be a tremendous exaggeration. So sometimes as I'll speak to Derech Guzman, that it always troubled me. How could it be? The Smak, one of the Bali Tosfos, Sefer Mitzvahs called him the Smak, in his introduction to a Sefer, says a very interesting thing. When the Chazal say Nachri Yosef b'Torah Hareu k'koyin gadol, they don't mean to compare a Nachri that learns his mitzvahs to a koyin gadol. Doesn't make basic sense. Chazal mean to say, just like amongst us, amongst Klal Yisrael, the koyin gadol is the most important of all people. Nachri Yosef b'Torah is the most important of all Gentiles. That is what Chazal mean to say, and that is a pshat of what I'm going to show him. The Smak in the introduction to his Sefer. Another very interesting revelation or makor that I found in this area is a Medrash Rav and Parshas Nosoi. The same mamar is in Medrash Rav, but the Lashon there is Nachri sheyosek b'Torah v'nezgayer hareu k'koyin gadol. Sheyosek b'Torah v'nezgayer. So he's a girl, but if studying Torah brought him to Geras, don't be mezalzel. Don't push him Sheva Mitzvahs Day. If the Kavod is not just going to be a Skaya, like the Rosh and Medrash, so what is the problem of not Rishiyosing the Torah Chai Misa? Another interesting Rambam in the same sugi as the last halacha in Shemitah V'Yoy. The Rambam writes, after explaining the uniqueness of Shevet Levi, their obligations and their privileges, the Rambam writes, "V'lo Shevet Levi b'vad, ela kol ish v'ish mekol boi oilom, asher nodbu liboy v'hevin amidoy, harei uniskadish kodesh kudishim. Kol ish v'ish mekol boi oilom." Kol boi oilom would include Chinese, Japanese, Americans, Scandinavians, Arabs. Kol ish v'ish mekol boi oilom, harei uniskadish kodesh kudishim. Like Shevet Kohana. So once again, I feel Kol Ish Kol Boy Olam Asher Not Boy Lavin Amedoy Lam Levnei Shem Lo Lishor. So you can't possibly do that without the Kohen Shabris. If you're so close to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, then obviously he wants to be one of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's chosen people. So maybe the Kohen of the Rambam is like the Medrash I just quoted. Ultimately, coming closer to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, he has to be one of his chosen few, and the Kavona is Ish Makor Bo Yolim, that ultimately, out of such total devotion and conviction is Mizgaya, and he becomes one of us. Maybe that is a pshat of that. So anyway, this is source number 2. The Gemara, with his Zohar Gimel, Baba Kaman Ches, Nochri Shiyosei B'Torah, Harei Hu Kedoin Gadol. Source number 3 is the Gemara of the Zohar. One of the 3 shittas of the Gemara. Who is a Gerrit Tosha? Kivaratzman Kol Torah Kula B'Yorchon Avegas. So the Chazon Ish wonders, does his missus have any significance? I think the pshat of the Chazon Ish is very far-fetched, very unreasonable. His missus mean nothing. You just expect him to go through the motions, go through the acts. I think we need to be machach our children. There are people that are different. You know, they ain't Jewish, so we don't expect them to do everything. Yes, we would expect them to dress up modestly and to have a code of conduct which is acceptable. But why would we expect them to plant fern and citrus and to shuckle the lulav and to sit in the sukkah? How would that affect the chonach of our children? So I think the pshat of the Chazon Ish is very unreasonable. The Rambam had learned the Gemara Kepashtis, and the Rambam proved from this Gemara that the Gerrit Tosha, according to one of the 3 opinions of the Gemara, is expected to take upon himself all the mitzvahs. Obviously, when a guy does take upon himself those mitzvahs, it bears significance. HaKadosh Baruch Hu has a certain level of nachas ruach. Otherwise, why would that define a Gerrit Tosha? So some people ask, the Gemara says, why wouldn't Avelis be an exception? Very simple. Because the Pasuk says, so if the Torah says we give him the Nevelis, then how would we expect him not to eat Nevelis? That is why Nevelis is the only mitzvah which would be an exception.
Is that the shita of the Rambam Legabe Gerrit Tosha? He follows that shita? No. Isn't that a contradiction?
It's not a contradiction because it is not necessarily the definition of a Gerrit Tosha. A Gerrit Tosha means to take upon himself what he is mechuyev, not what he could take upon himself voluntarily. But the Rambam proves from that shitta that if he volunteers to perform other mitzvahs, it has significance, and he's mekabel sachar. That doesn't necessarily mean that the halacha needs to be according to that shitta. The Rambam paskins sheva mitzvahs b'noach, because it is enough if he takes upon himself what he is obligated to take upon himself, what HaKadosh Baruch Hu demands from him, and he doesn't have to go beyond that to achieve the status of a Gerrit Tosha. Koheres Rabba Perek Aleph. There's a very interesting medrash, and the medrash speaks about Laos and Lavoi. And the medrash says, Laos and Lavoi, HaKadosh Baruch Hu will be moitzi a keruz. What is a keruz? It will be announced. It will be announced throughout the world. and there will be a huge line, huge, 100, 200 million people, and the Kodesh Baruch Hu won't like that line. No, something is wrong. Because all the Muslims will stand together with us in that line. And then the Kodesh Baruch Hu will make, no, announcement number 2. There was a mistake. Kol shalayochal nevelas utvefes v'shkotzim v'ramoshim yovai v'yitl schoroi, and it will dwindle down to a much shorter cube. So Yosef Lavoi, obviously, the Kodesh Baruch Hu will say, Kol mishalayochal v'osachazer yovai v'yitl schoroi. Well, it's not included in Sheva Mitzvahs B'nai Noach. It is something they made up for themselves, so why would they deserve any sachar? Even announcement number 2. Kol shalayocham nevedas atefesh kotzim v'ramoshim. If some of the non-Jews would say, yes, I mean, this is something we observe, obviously there will be makal sachar. This could be another source for the Rambam. Source number 5 is the Gemara in Chulin Daf Tzadik Beis Amud Aleph. The Gemara says, Shloishim mitzvahs shekiblu aleihem b'nei Noach ve'eino mikayim elu. Shloisha. B'nei Noach took upon themselves 30 mitzvahs, and they only performed 3, 10%. Rashi says, I don't know what this Gemara means. What are the 30 mitzvahs? We are aware of Sheva Mitzvahs B'nai Noach. The Ramami Pano says that when we put together all the different shittas, and Sanhedrin, Daf Nun Ches, Daf Nun Tes, the various different shittas, what are the Sheva Mitzvahs? We reached 30. Well, I counted, and it's far from 30. No, doesn't reach 30. It's an idea, but the arithmetic doesn't add up. It's not 30. So obviously the understanding of the Rambam was they were mekabel alatzman various mitzvahs beyond Sheva Mitzvahs B'nai Noach. And that's a Gemara Chulin Tzadik Beis Amud Aleph. Maybe this is the lie of the Rambam, that a guy could take upon himself voluntarily different mitzvahs even though it is not included in his chiyuv. And we find similar mamorim in Yerushalmi Avodah Zorah Daf Tes Amud Aleph. The Babli deals with goyim that took upon themselves shloisha mitzvahs in the past. The Yerushalmi speaks about the future. In Avodah Zorah Daf Gimel, Chazal deal with what will transpire la'asad l'avod when HaKadosh Baruch Hu will bring the Geula Shleima, and all the nations will come together and try to plea and try to bargain. We were so good to the Jews, they will all say. We were so good to the Jews. What a chutzpah. You know, the Romans will say, whatever we did, we just did for the Jews. And the Persians will say the same. And they will ask, give us some mitzvahs, and we will prove our dedication. So the Yerushalmi says that the Yosef Lavoi, they'll take upon themselves, they'll put out tefillin, they'll wear tzitzis, obviously assuming that, you know, it will mean something for HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and we find a similar meditation in Bereshis Rabbah, Parashat Tzadik Ches, and this all fits into the same context of the Gemara Chulin Tzadik Beis. So the Yerushalmi, the Medrash speak about the future, the Gemara speaks about the past, but all these mamorim seem to add up to the basic idea, the basic assumption that a boy can take upon himself different mitzvahs, even though they are beyond Sheva Mitzvahs B'nai Noach. Source number 6 or number 7 is the Yerushalmi in Demai Yud Beis Amud Aleph, dealing with the question whether we could give tevel for a non-Jew. So some of the Meforshim of the Yerushalmi say the problem is our making use of tevel and giving for a non-Jew. But the Pnei Moshe says we're dealing with a guy that took upon himself the mitzvah of Tumas HaMaisos, and therefore we should not be machshel him with achilas tevel. So this Yerushalmi could be an additional source to the chiddush of the Rambam that a non-Jew, if he wishes to perform different mitzvahs above and beyond his obligation, mitzvahs that have no shaykhs with sheva mitzvahs, nevertheless, he would be mekabel sechar. So we brought 7 different sources from Bavli, from Yerushalmi, from the Medish, possible sources from which the Rambam could derive this tremendous chiddush, but it is quite clear that 3 different sources of Rambam, as we quoted at the beginning of the Shia, Luchas Malachim, in Ilchas Mila, and in Parasha Mishnah regarding Tumas HaMaises, Perigimon Mishnah Tesach, and Sechtes Tumas. This is a big chiddush which many Achronim weren't aware of, as I quoted at the beginning of the Shia. The Meiri seems to be unique between other Rishonim, and he seems to have a more compassionate and lenient view generally towards non-Jews that we find in most other sources in Torah Shebal Peh. In Baba Kama, in Vilna Shas, Daf Lamed Ches Amud Aleph, Daf Kuf Yud Gimel Amud Aleph, when the Gemara deals with monetary issues, Bein Yisrael L'Nochri, and the Torah gives some more rights to a Jew than to a non-Jew. And in Vilna Shas, there are 2 little paragraphs on the side of the daf taken from Shittim Gabetzes, quoting the Meiri, that these halachas regard only the non-Jews of yore, the barbarians. But those amongst whom we dwell today, and that was written 800 years ago, who are decent, they are religious, they believe in HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and therefore we should relate to them the same way as we relate to our brethren, that is in the Vilna Shas. I gave a shir in the Yarkei Kala, in the Mira, a few days ago. So he asked for a Gemara, and I was brought Maran Gemaras, and I didn't find those 2 Hadoras. When I say Maran Gemaras, I don't mean something, out of consensus. I mean, Schottenstein and Neis Vahoda, I don't know why they took that out. So maybe they were aware of the some soifel. In Shalos the Jews, the Teres Chachomim. Teres Chachomim is the Jews of the Baruch Tam. One of the greatest Gedolim 200 years ago, the Baruch Frankel, tremendously admired the Baruch Tam. And some Yud Al Nachoshem Mishpach, there's a correspondence between the Baruch Tam and some soifel. That some soifel says, what they printed in Vilna Shas of Bava Kama is Dvorim Zorim, Lo Yotzom HaPikotshoi V'Mitzvah L'Machkoi. It's a mitzvah to erase and take out of there. That's what the Sefer writes, a tremendous chiddush. So maybe Schottenstein and Neis Vahoda were aware of that tshuva of the Baruch Tam. I don't know, maybe they had some different criteria, but it took them 15 minutes to find an old Gemara for me. An old Poshet of Vilna Shas, in which those 2 paragraphs of Shittim Gabetzes are printed on the daf. The Chassam Sofer is extremely unreasonable. 200 years ago, in the days of the Chassam Sofer, we didn't have the Meiri. So all we had is the quote from Shittim Gabetzes. And the Chassam Sofer argued, Lo Yotzom HaPikotshoi. Today, we have the new Meiri, and that is based on a manuscript of Ksav Yad of the Meiri. And the Chassam Sofer wasn't aware that at least 10 places in the Meiri, it's not only in Bava Kama, in many different places, the Meiri has a very inclusive approach to Goyim. And Bein Hashar, when the Gemara says in Sanhedrin Nun Ches, Nochri Shosek B'Torah Chayav Misa, the Meiri writes that if he wants to learn Torah to appreciate Chachmas Yisrael, then he is entitled to do so, and we will teach it, which is a tremendous chiddush. We will not find it any other tradition. So we could say, it's a falsification, which isn't reasonable. It's 10 times in the Meiri, and if anybody wanted to falsify, why dafka with the Meiri, and why didn't he do it with many other Rishonim? And it is the Ksav Yad of the Meiri. One could argue, maybe he wrote it, Lin Tzorchein, the Sefer Torah Be'enei Hagoyim, maybe the pachad of the censors, but historically, we do not find. Anything we find in Rishonim, could we just guess why he wrote it? Obviously, that was the shit of the Meiri. It is not mainstream. We do not find it in the Rambam, or the Tur, or the Ramban, or the Rashba, but it is the shit of one of the Rishonim who was generally more lenient and more inclusive towards different aspects of say that should be Yahalacha Psukim. Our Messiah is based primarily on the Rambam and the Ramban and the Rishonim leading to the Torah and the Shulchan Aruch. However, but this obviously is the opinion of one of the Rishonim. So in this week's parasha, we learn about the encounter. Could I have a Chumash Bereshis if it's not a term? The encounter, the faithful encounter between Yaakov and Esau. When Yaakov, being extremely worried, prepares for this encounter. After Esau vowed to kill Yaakov, and Yaakov had to flee, being prodded by Yitzchak and Rivka, to flee, to run away, to go to Lavan. And after years, finally, they meet. Vayiro Yaakov miyod v'yetzeloi, Rashi writes, why was he afraid? Shema yidem achet. V'yachatz hasuam asher ito v'esatzoi v'saboka v'gmar m'shnei machanois v'yoymo. Im yov Esau l'machnu achas v'yikro v'hoyu ha'machane hanisho lefleito. Rashi explains the way Yaakov prepares for his meeting. Being afraid, letfilah, ledoiron, v'lemalchom. V'hoyu ha'machane hanisho lefleito, hitken atzmoi l'shloishi dvorim, ledoiron, letfilah, v'lemalchom. The Ramban, in his general approach to Yaakov Avinu, being expressed in many different parshas and Sefer Bereshis, the Ramban explains our destiny and the future of Klal Yisrael is indicated in this parsha. And the Ramban writes, L'doilei Solom, we will be faced with adversity, with tragedy, with strife. And Yaakov taught us that Tefillah, L'doilei, L'malchama. Three different areas in which we should always be mishtal. Starting off with Tefillah. Davening to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Nimtzachem v'seichel toiv v'einei Elokim v'odam. HaKadosh Baruch Hu should be with us. L'doilen. Doilen in its modern version probably would be defined as the promise or l'malcham. Ultimately, l'malcham. So the Ramban writes, that is what Yaakov teaches us throughout the ages. We all know Masa of a similar bonim. The Ramban goes beyond with Masa of a similar bonim, and the Ramban in the first passage in Chumash Shemais coins a new phrase, a new idea. Masa of a yitzira bonim, creation. What the others did, they molded our future. They affected the form and the shape of our destiny. Masa is Yitzir Labonim, writes the Ramban, and not only Sivan Labonim. But in this Ramban, in this week's class, we learn that Masa is Hoyoroa Labonim. It is also instructive. And Yaakov teaches us how to deal with our relationships, with our surroundings, with different people, with different nations, in Golas and coming back to Eretz Yisrael. Letfilah, L'doilen, L'malcham. And the Ramban goes on to explain, Im Yova Yesel L'machna Hu Achaz V'yikol V'ho Ha'machna Ha'nisho L'fleito. The Rambam writes, this is part of the Jewish experience. Im Yova Yesel L'machna Hu Achaz V'yikol V'ho Ha'machna Ha'nisho L'fleito. And we see this throughout history. When Jews were persecuted in Spain, they fled to Portugal. And when the Inquisition came to Portugal, they went to Holland and to Poland, the wandering Jew. But there was always some self-hating somewhere. And that is what Yaakov defines our future and our destiny. V'hoyu hamachana nishor fleito. And the Rabban goes on, when Yankov is, v'yachatz esawav l'shtei machanois, v'revach tasimu ben eido la'eido. The Rambam writes, it is also part of our story, the story of the Jews. We face tragedy many times, but they're always between one gezerah and the other. HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave us a period of calm and serenity to rebuild and replenish in Ruchnius, in Gashmius, from Chorban Bayis Vision to Chorban Bayis Shiny, from one tragedy to the other. We cannot understand our destiny. But what Yankov taught his children in this fateful encounter, this is in a capsule, capsulated the entire story of Gos. Reva Tasimu ben Eida. And ultimately, Ad Avoi El Adoni Seira, Chazal say, he never came to soil. That is, La'asad La'asad. Va'olu Mushiam Bahar Tzirin, Lishboites Har Esa, Va'oiso Lashem HaMelucha. That is what Yankov said, Ad Avoi El Adoni Seira. When the Ramban says, Masa Avos Yitzir Rabonam, he is referring to all three of us. However, Yankov is unique. Yankov is the one that gave us the koyach to prevail in the long and terrible days. I spoke about this idea last week. Avraham Tikkun Shachas Yitzchak Minta, Yankov Arvis. Yankov Arvis because night symbolizes ghosts. Dark and tragic days in which sometimes we didn't even see a glimmer of light. Yankov Tikkun Arvis. And when Yankov leaves Eretz Canaan and he goes to Eretz Mitzrayim, the Ramban says, Yankov, Sorel Klan Yisrael as a derech begolos. And it is in the merit and the schus of Yankov Avinu that we could prevail against all odds in the most miraculous of ways. That is the koyach of Yankov Avinu. So the interpretation, the Perush of the Ramban in this parsha, every pasuk indicates, and it is a remez, different stages, and the Siyata D'Shmaya that's with us throughout the ages in this long and terrible life. Let us hope a Korah B'Yameinu on the schus of Yankov Avinu. Yankov should once again meet Esav Ad Avoi El Adoni Seiro Va'olu Mushir Bahar Tzion Lishpat as Al Esav Va'oiso Lashem HaMricho B'Biaz Goel Tzedek B'Mhero B'Yameinu Amen. And once again, apologize. Next week we will have no shir, coming shir 2 weeks time.
Mitzvot.